Everyone. Welcome to another episode of Larp Chat Live. Today is episode 8, Spoonies in Larp, where we're going to be focusing on issues when it comes to the physical and mental health of our players and ways that organizers can make Larp accessible for those who are dealing with chronic and acute conditions. So, for this, we have two special guests today, Marshall Bradshaw and Shoshana Kasak. Did I get that correct for pronunciation?
Kesak, it's cool.
Kazakh. Okay, cool. Trust
You
me,
got mine
Carols,
fine.
Carls, I get the same thing as well here. All right, well, let's start with Shoshana. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So my name's Shoshana Kesak. I'm a LARP writer and game designer. I've been doing this about 12 years now. I'm the CEO of Phoenix Outlaw Productions. We're a local company out of New Jersey. We're working on a bunch of different projects. I've done stuff for everything from freeform work to doing blockbuster games for a couple of different companies. So yeah, I've been doing LARPs across the industry for, like I said, about 10 years now. 12 years.
All right, that is definitely a long time here. All right, and how about you, Marshall? Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I am a DC-based theater critic with the blog DC Theater Scene. Additionally, I am a big-time LARPer and non-electronic game designer. As part of that, I facilitate the DC area LARP meetup, and I've done work with the Game Theater, the Geek Initiative, and Damocles Thread Development. And on the theater side of things, I'm on the board of the Arcanus and have done a lot of work with TBD Immersive, DC's biggest immersive theater company. And for the purposes of this conversation, I am a Spoonie LARPer who has also designed 2 games about my chronic illness.
All right, great. Glad to have both of you here. And then, just for a recap, for those of you who are joining in, this is an interactive talk show. So if you're watching us live through Twitch TV, there is that little chat window on the side. The instructions are on the screen as well. If you want to ask a question, it is !redeem question, and then you type out everything else. Don't even worry about putting in quotation marks. That's going to pop you in the queue. That's going to be important because as we go on, there's usually a lot of conversation that happens in our chat, and we just want to make sure that if you have a question you want our guests here to answer, that we are able to log it and make sure that it gets over to everyone here. So with that, looks like Tara's back. So Tara, it's your turn.
Ah, yes. Momentary technical difficulty. Had to load back in. Happens all the time. So to get started, I am curious about what the both of you think regarding the definition of a spoonie. So what is a spoonie, and does that refer to like physical health, mental health? What do you think?
Sure, I can go first.
Mhm.
Spooning, in my experience, is a term that has come up to in regards to a lot of things. It's spoons is an allegory really that I've seen online for energy that you have throughout the day, like how many spoons you have, and how much energy you have towards the things that you need to do through your life. And I think that relates to both physical and mental energy that you have, and it relates to just in general what you can expend. And it was in regards to, I think it was like a meme or an article that was going around for years, and then just became a term that's been used for people who have chronic illness and mental health issues over time. So, unless Marshall, what do you think? Is that about right, or what do you think?
I think I saw. I want to say this might have been the original, where the story goes that it's 2 people sitting at a diner, and one person is chronically ill, and they want to explain to their friend, like, this is why, like, sometimes it's hard for me, and they just like grab spoons and start lining them up, and that's like where we get this weirdly specific term. I think a huge thing for me is to point out that it's totally can be mental, can be physical. There are so many different things that drain you. In fact, I was just at a multiple sclerosis retreat in Ocean City, which fans of the Geek Initiative's digital LARPs will know I used for my character.
First bite, second birth, yes.
Yeah. But during it, a doctor was talking about fatigue in MS patients and pointed out that we don't necessarily know where it always comes from. Sometimes it comes from, a lot of the secondary symptoms will then cause fatigue, and sometimes it's just the disease itself. And you don't have to know exactly what's causing your fatigue for it to be real and for you to be a tired spoonie who like has a good excuse and can do whatever you need.
Awesome. Thank you for those definitions. And before we get into really diving into how this relates to LARP and how we can deal with these issues at LARP and help our community members that have illnesses at LARP, I really want to point out the, I guess, existence of invisible illnesses. I know, we have various things going on with us, and for those of us here, a lot of those illnesses are sometimes or partially at least invisible, and that's huge for me. For people who are used to seeing me, they can recognize when I'm having a high pain day, when I'm swelling, when I like suddenly look 4 sizes bigger than I was yesterday. But for people who maybe have never LARPed with me before, have never met me, they have no idea. There's no way they would know. And communicating my needs has been really tough. So I do kind of want to point out that sometimes illnesses are invisible. A really rough one for me recently was when I was traveling, and Shoshana was actually the person I reached out to about this because I was in so much pain. I was ambulatory, but like I definitely should have been in a wheelchair. And I felt like because I technically could walk and I'm not usually in a wheelchair that I shouldn't be asking for one, but really I should have asked for assistance at the airport. And stuff like that's hard, and LARP seems to compound that because you want to kind of like push through the pain sometimes, or especially when your pain is invisible. So I'm really curious about what your experiences have been like with pain that is both visible and invisible. And have you ever felt like at a LARP you need to kind of push through?
Yeah, I mean, so I've had invisible illness pretty much since I was 16. I don't mind. I talk about my issues publicly a lot. I was diagnosed bipolar when I was 16. So I started out there, and I've had fibromyalgia and an endocrine disorder, a pretty serious one. So I have gotten progressively actually more sick over the years. So when I started out LARPing, I was already dealing with a lot of invisible illnesses that, I sort of had to manage. And first in parlor LARPs and freeform LARPs, and then with weekend boffer games, especially pretty intense ones. And a lot of the time I had to explain to people, like, you can't see that I'm sick, but I am, and I have a lot of things to manage. Over time, it's become a little easier only because I've actually had to start using a wheelchair. So people are more conscious of the fact that I am disabled, and that, only because they see what they accept as like a visible sign of disability. And I've noticed it's very difficult to get people otherwise originally to notice, like, when I was having a high pain day, for people to recognize that, no, I couldn't run through the woods. There was one game when I was just pretty sure I was going to get murdered, in character. And I stopped because I couldn't push any further. I just couldn't. My body just wouldn't go further. And one of the staff members came over to me and asked, like, are you okay? And I was like, if my character has to take a death, that's fine, but I can't move another inch. Like, I'm done. And the staff member just walked me back to ops, and that was it. But like, it came to that moment where I was willing to push until I literally couldn't stand up anymore. And it became a very big problem over the years for me. And I pushed way too hard on way too many occasions. So I don't do that anymore. Like, I take way better care of myself now. But yeah, I've definitely done that for years, and it was rough. And LARP running too, actually running events. I've done that way too often too, to the point of near collapse after, so it's definitely a balance,
Marshall, have you experienced that as well?
I have so many thoughts springing from this topic, but I think one that really hits me is I almost never, I've only ever been to one live combat LARP so far. And because of my various symptoms, I did not feel comfortable doing combat, which got into something that I can speak kind of uniquely about on this panel, which is not feeling like a man if I'm not doing combat at a live LARP. And I almost never feel nervous about my masculinity because normally I think it's generally trash. But for some reason, surrounded in this like really kind of masculine setting, it felt very off-putting to just say, I'm going to play a healer. I will be the only male healer. I will learn from a woman and be a fellow apprentice with a woman. And that was a little stressful. However, in the big picture, zooming out from that one experience, I've found the LARP community at large to be a really easy place to be heard and be believed and to be honest about myself. I'm not entirely out about being chronically ill outside of the LARP community, though I'm kind of pushing the envelope on that by just recently allowing my tag on this Facebook post on my wall. So I wonder if there's any non-LARPers watching from that right now. But it's been excellent being around people who have outright stated goals of listening to people and checking in with them and being responsive to that. So I think we are generally pretty lucky about having people who will listen.
Yeah, and different LARP communities certainly respond in different ways. When, for me, I started out not really having too many issues. Like, I knew something was going on with my body. I knew that I was slowing down, even though I was still in my 20s. I didn't really know what was going on. Like, my allergies were really, really bad. And I thought, like, okay, it must just be like being out in the woods. I'm having allergy issues. And then over time, it became apparent there was more. I was in a very bad car accident, and that just set everything off. And even just being in the car accident, it was like, you know, it was just really difficult not being there. And then what did you miss? And it's really especially tough with those campaign LARPs. And that was certainly something I experienced that kind of like worsened over time. And then I have rheumatoid arthritis. I have hypothyroidism and polycystic ovarian syndrome. So all of those things vary in how severely they affect you and how severely those conditions affect each other based on whatever's going on in your life, or how much stress you have, or how much rain there might be in the air tomorrow. And so one day I can be completely fine, and the next day I can't get out of bed, or vice versa. And that's been like probably the most difficult thing for me to sort of adapt. And, you know, I've also experienced that kind of like that sudden onset of a medical issue because of that. So like I'll be okay, and then all of a sudden it'll be like, oh, I can't really move, I need to go rest. And I've dealt with that, and I have, you know, my own kind of answers to how I have done it in the past and how I could do better in the future. But I'm curious about both of you. Have you ever experienced being at an event and everything's okay, and then all of a sudden you're super sick? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, that happens to me a lot. When I first started, I have a disease called Cushing's disease, which involved a tumor that grew in my pituitary gland that causes endocrine issues. What we didn't know about the tumor, so all I knew is I was getting these blinding 4-day migraines, and extreme fatigue, like horrible symptoms. And so I started getting them, and I got one, I remember, right in the middle of playing, you know, Zombie Apocalypse Weekend, where I'm fighting as like a frontline fighter. And some of the people, they like, I was sleeping in like a tent, I think it was, or like a really bad bunk. Somebody gave up their like quiet room bunk to help me stay like away from everybody else and in a quiet place. And I lost like half the weekend. And things progressively got worse from there. But like I dropped in the middle of a combat a couple of times, like threw up on the side of like the place. And I've had that before, like when I'm running games too, which is really hard. Like I help run a production company, and what was it, Gen Con? I got super sick, like right before we were going to go run a game at Gen Con. And I was like, all right, I guess I got to take my medicine and just pull it out. And I was absolutely like completely done. Like I couldn't do pretty much anything. And thankfully I have a wonderful team, but like sometimes you just got to pull through, and it sucks and it really hurts. And then afterwards I was wiped out for like half a day. But like when it's about playing a game, I'm willing to take a little bit more time, and okay, I'm going to lose half an event. I might not be able to even go. I had to back out of going to big blockbuster LARPs that I've paid for because I was too sick, which really sucked. Like I was supposed to go to the first Inside Hamlet. Couldn't go, I missed Magiscola this year because I was sick. So it sucks. But when I run games, it's different. I tend to push myself a lot harder and just take the pills and go do what you got to do and then fall over afterwards. But that's sort of me.
Marshall, have you experienced that as well?
Thankfully, only a little bit. I know I had one instance during my first ever blockbuster LARP was actually fairly recent. It was New World Magic School of Seven. And I was doing this scene. It was just one-on-one with someone that I was LARPing with really closely. We had a romance over the course of the weekend. And with my MS and with a lot of people, it's easy to have your limbs like fall asleep if you just like lay wrong. And had my character get sick because going for that bleed. And I wound up on a hospital bed and then trying to do this scene with someone propped up on my arm. And I was holding their hand. And I realized partway through the scene that this is the first time that it ever happened to me that I totally lost motor control.
Mm.
I couldn't feel or move my hand, which was like touching this other player, which also like made me feel really worried because I was holding her hand and I was worried like, hey, is what I'm doing okay because I'm not getting feedback on myself, but also this is the worst, like most acute symptom I had ever had. Fortunately for me, the fix was just I moved a little bit, I paused for a moment, kind of continued the scene, things got okay again. Then I was able to talk to that person after the scene, after we had left the space, and just say like, whoa, this just happened to me. And I wasn't really asking for anything from them except like an ear, and they were great about responding to me in that. In general though, like something that comes up with me is when I sign up for like a blockbuster and people ask like what sort of accommodations you need, it's always a little tricky because like I said, I've been pretty lucky. I haven't had a lot of really acute things happen, but I know they're possible. And it's hard for me to ask for accommodations when I think like, oh, it's a slight chance. A thing that I frequently put is like, if I'm ever asked, do you want a first story room? I always put like, yes, but put me at the end of your list. For if more people say yes, period, put them in front of me. But it's still this hairy thing of I'm taking a gamble every time. And like Shoshana mentioned, these tickets aren't cheap and you can wind up losing like what was going to be an amazing experience.
Yeah, and I think one thing we all have in common also is not only do we play LARPs, we design them, and we've all worked on things of various lengths and types, and we've done everything from a short LARP that you could play at a convention. We've contributed to blockbusters and digital LARPs as well. So it's kind of really varying levels of accessibility here. And reconciling that, not just as a player, but as a designer and wanting to make your games accessible is always a challenge. Because it's like, you go to, like, there's one site I'm looking at right now, and I'm like, I can make it down the ladder. And I'm like, but not everybody could. And do I even want to run a game where, like, I'm going to make it so that automatically some people that I know and would want to LARP with can't come to the game? That's really, really tough. So how do you reconcile that, especially on the design end, about, like, hey, I want to run this, but it has to be accessible?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, so one of the things that got to me is as my health got worse is, first of all, I totally understand about the asking for accommodation thing. My list of accommodations has gotten longer over the years. And like, it went from like, oh, I need to possibly take a seat occasionally and have a quiet place to sleep, to here are my dietary restrictions and here's where medication comes in. And now I have a medical alert bracelet. Like, shit's getting, pardon my language, geez, sorry. But like things are getting like longer, and I have to put in for those accommodations if I want to come to a LARP at this point. And I know what that can be like to put on an organizer, but at the same time, I know that they're necessary if we want to, make games accessible. So I've been having a lot of conversations with my team when we're designing stuff about looking at locations, first of all, looking at designing the game, like what are one of the things I learned in my game design program is what are the verbs that your game is about, right? Like, what are your characters going to do at the game? So like thinking about those verbs, like what are they jumping, climbing, exploring? If that's the case, that's going to actually put a lot of people out of the game if they can't do those things. So trying to balance out what the verbs of a game's design is with, like, okay, if it's going to be jumping and exploring, is there another way of exploring that doesn't involve physicality? And also just talking about locations. I mean, location is such a huge issue in designing LARPs in the first place. Finding someplace that doesn't have a ramp immediately almost puts that out of use for me. I'm looking at a great location for a game for next year, and it has steps. And I know that I'm ambulatory enough to get out of my wheelchair, but I have some severe issues with using this location, even though it's literally perfect. And I'm not sure I'll take it, but I don't know. I'm conflicted. So it comes down to a really big question of what do you put at the top of your list, and then how do you make it as accommodatable as possible, knowing that you may actually like cut somebody out. That's really rough. And I've had a LARP recently where they're like, no, it's down a flight of stairs. We will literally carry you down the stairs and up again if you need it in the chair. And that was like when I said, okay, I'm going to give you a bunch of my money to come to this game. So, that's a major deal for me, is to know that like, if this game is going to try to make the accommodation and go that far, then it definitely shows that they care. And that's sort of where I try to go that far with my design, with my team as well, as best we can.
Awesome. Marshall, how do you reconcile that in playing and designing especially?
Well, for designing smaller games, I know I try to put in there as much as possible explicitly, like, hey, change any mechanic that anyone is not comfortable with doing or able to do. Also, don't ask them which of those it is. Like, and I think that's an ethos that even if it's not on the LARP script, everyone should come at this with, where we LARP because it is such a participatory art form, and you can get so invested because you are creating it as you go. And that also means you're responsible for everything that you do. And you can throw out the LARP script left and right and adapt it for the people who are playing. And I hope people definitely have the courage to do that.
Yeah, and I think, as we progress, there are a lot of other options as well. One thing I'm really working hard on is the idea of having a fully immersive in-person event and then having a digital component running simultaneously. So that way, the LARP is accessible. And I kind of just want to like run an in-person event and have the other thing run at the same time and be like, hey, person, I trust you, run this, have fun, and I'm not even going to know what's going on. So there are some, like, I guess more like innovative ways to accommodate there, but ultimately those in-person locations can be really, really tough. One thing that I am really looking forward to trying, and I've been saying this like all the time, is the black box scenario, which they're going to have at Magic School as Yule this year, because physically I feel like I have a lot of limitations in some of the environments. Like, even if you're doing non-Bakra combat and you're just using a wand or something, it's like I push myself running up and down hills, chasing people downstairs, even though we're trying to be as safe as possible, especially at that LARP. I still push myself. And I'm excited for the black box because we talk about a whole bunch of reasons to use it and a whole bunch of different ways to put LARP in an enclosed setting. And I'm like, physically, that's going to be really good for me because I'm not running around a huge location. Like, I'm limited to a certain space. And so my broad gestures are going to be limited, and I'm not going to, like, inadvertently overdo it. Which brings me to my next point, overdoing it. When you have chronic pain, for those watching, a lot of times you almost feel like your body's punishing you the next day. So you can start having a great time, having lots of fun, and the punishment's forthcoming because you wake up the next day and you're in pain and you're hurting, and then it can lead to all sorts of like mental stuff, at least for me, like, oh, I hate myself, or I'm not allowed to have fun. And the other portion of that is like, okay, so that's how I feel. It's not right for me to put that on another player or on an organizer. Like, they're not my therapist, So in terms of that whole like punishment scenario, there's probably a much more mentally healthy way to describe it. But like, do you experience that? And like, what do you tell yourself the day after you have a great time at a LARP and maybe wake up experiencing some residual pain?
That happens to me all the time. It's almost every game that I go to. I mean, I like I said, I've gone from being relatively in good shape to, running huge battles with like 300 people across a field. And like, I remember those experiences very, very clearly. I also remember what Monday morning after those LARPs was like, and that for 3 days afterwards, my body hated me. And just, I was also going to grad school at the same time. So I would show up at class on Monday morning with like my body just like beaten to hell. Like I almost dislocated my shoulder one weekend and I was just crawled into, class the next morning looking like I'd been run over by something. And thankfully it was a game design program. So when I explained what happened, they understood a little bit. And it just got progressively worse over time, to the point now where if I go out even to a parlor LARP or a free form for the weekend, I can sometimes come back, after 6 hours and I'm done for like a day. So it is hard. It is hard to like look at, going out and doing the thing that you love and realizing that like that means that you're taking a bunch of the spoons that you might need for the next day to like do laundry or even get out of bed, and realizing that like it is a balance. And especially, you're trying to be an adult and make money and live in this life and like have a social life and whatever you have, you got to balance everything out. And sometimes it means realizing that you might miss a LARP that weekend. You might make the choice that you have to stay home and work instead and take care of yourself, because if you go away for the weekend, you're going to lose like 4 days afterwards or 3 days. And it does feed, for me, definitely into a sense of sometimes feeling a little betrayed by your body, and sometimes getting into that like that meant bad mental headspace for me. And oftentimes it helps to refocus for me by saying like, it just means that I have to decide and prioritize where my energy goes and like how to use it at its most optimal, but also at its most fulfilling. So I choose very carefully now what LARPs I go to. I choose what experiences I want to do, even at those LARPs. So if somebody's like, we're going to go run off into the woods and, do this, wacky stuff. And I'm like, but if I do that, I'm out of the LARP for the rest of the weekend. I will choose instead to make a slightly safer choice for me physically. The thing that I like to tell people a lot is, especially if they're, people sometimes do what's called like the cult of hardcore at LARPs, where they're like, come on, guys, let's go, let's push ourselves. And my answer to people who are feeling, stressed about that and stuff is, are you going to pay my medical bills Monday morning? Are you going to be there living in my shoes Monday morning? Okay, I am. So think about that. Think about what it feels like, and then make that decision for yourself.
Marshall, I know actually a little bit less about your condition than I do about Shoshana's and about my own. Do you experience that too, like where you push yourself and then you are kind of like punished for it the next day?
A little bit. Thankfully, only a little bit. And a huge thing for me is trying to make sure that what I'm coming back to is as clean as an apartment as possible, and limit the demands I'm going to have the next day, and try to book time for me to just sit in the bathtub and just kind of reflect and rest my legs. But
that's awesome.
that's pretty much it for me.
Yeah, I love that preparation, so that when you come back, you're not coming back to a mess. That's a really good one. That's certainly one that I think any Spoonie can use, and I think probably knowing a lot of people who don't have mental or physical health conditions on the regular could probably also benefit from, because people get stressed out when they're like, okay, I'm packing at the last minute, and then you come back to like laundry you didn't do before you left. No. So that preparation tip is really good for everybody's health, I think. And speaking about mental health conditions, and I have a little less experience with this because most of my stuff is like the result of what's going on physically and my frustrations over maybe not being able to do stuff. But I don't have too many like standalone mental health issues, so I'm a little in the dark here. But mental health conditions at LARP, how do you think we should accommodate them as like organizers and designers, and as people who may suffer from mental health issues? What is the best way to communicate that you're having an issue and that you maybe need to step back?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. So, coming from my perspective, I came into this community as somebody who was originally not open about the fact that I have bipolar disorder, but then became really just sort of open about it by necessity almost, because I'm conscious of the fact that certain stressors can make bipolar worse. And even though I'm medicated and such, when you go to a LARP, LARPs are intense. They can really trigger emotions and such, but they can also trigger things like manic episodes for me. So being aware of that and making people aware around me of sort of what my behaviors might look like when I'm getting manic was important to me. That was my decision, though, to come out and talk about that publicly. And I know for a lot of people, they're not as public, and that's absolutely valid. Like, your mental health and your mental health status and your health status in general is not, it does not need to be public knowledge. It doesn't. But understanding that your mental health may become a part of your weekend event or a part of your LARP event is important, and also knowing how to communicate that with the staff, and how staff members can have tools available to make it comfortable for a player to speak about these things with them is super important. I think a lot of the communities right now that I'm in contact with and a part of have safety mechanisms in place and safety techniques and workshops, especially in advance of games, where you have opt-out rules or opt-in things. For example, for people who have triggers like PTSD, for example, or who have just phobias that they need to not be triggered with, or situations where they may need to step out of a scene because something's going on with them. And you have like the look down mechanic where you don't need to explain yourself. Like that was, I think, one of the most revolutionary things when it came up in LARPs was just where you don't have to explain yourself as to why you're stepping out of a scene. However, we use that mechanic. It was super important that that baseline was set, that it doesn't matter if I find your role play offensive or I'm really depressed right now because of the scene and I'm having a lot of bleed and I need to step out, that was respected by all of us is a huge deal. And it's such a different relationship than most communities have with one another. I think that revolutionized things. So having those safety mechanics is so important, because it doesn't necessarily require you to stand up and be like, hi, I'm this person and I have this illness. It gives you the tools to step out and feel safe. I think you could do a whole panel literally or a whole weekend talking about this, honestly, but this is sort of my like off the cuff.
Marshall, any other thoughts on kind of mental health and being in tune with your mental health, or other safety features or functions?
Oh yeah, like 2.5 ideas. A big one for me is getting some echoes on your line, Shoshana. Don't know how that just started out of nowhere, but with MS. And I think, with several other illnesses, an issue with, that echo is still going on. It's going off a little bit.
Sorry. I'll headphones. Hang on.
Thank you so much. I mean, but give it up for Shoshana's amazing hat, which unfortunately we are losing now.
I know, right?
Love my hat. Hang
on. Yeah, as I was saying, with MS and probably with a lot of other illnesses, there are mental symptoms, including just a loss of cognition. For me, 2 triggers for that can be overheating and physical exertion, which are 2 things that are very prevalent at LARP. I mean, for me, it's why I am no longer an actor very often, because I had one really distinct experience where I could tell that as soon as I was under stage lights, I started just wilting and my memory just left me. And recently I was at a Blockbuster LARP, and by Saturday, I could tell that my mind could not keep up. Fortunately, that was at New World Magic School at 10, so I could just say, oh, I had this like mind potion, and that's why I'm... So that was kind of nice, but if I were in the same situation again, and I suspect that I will be, 2 things that I'll want to do to help with that are, 1, literally put a reminder in my phone for noon on Saturday saying, nap. I'm sorry, this is your phone telling you, but you got to nap now. Additionally, Tara, you mentioned early on this idea of having friends who know you well enough to like reach out and can tell when you're not having a great day. And I might also take that kind of reminder and find someone who can be like, Marshall might be real dumb midday Saturday, including not doing anything about the fact that he is mentally
I'm only
spent.
laughing because you always reach out to me and ask if I've slept.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I think if you don't want to talk to the LARP facilitators or the people running the event, you can use mechanics that will allow you to just take command of your own stuff. Like I said that I had a bad potion, or using look down, or find a friend that you are comfortable talking to who will be able to help you. And one other thought on the subject is I, in the past, have really benefited from having a counselor at a Blockbuster LARP. And I know it's like, can be a big cost. It can be a tough thing to organize. But if you're going to have really intense play, that can be a great resource for your players. And I hope people consider using counselors in and out of character at their large events.
Absolutely. And one thing you mentioned also, was something that I've used before without really thinking about it. You said you can use some in-game like story or like plot to sort of like lean on that a bit. And not last year, but the year before, I played NWM5, and then I came back for run 7, and I was working on Dragon Thrones in between. And one really good decision I made was I was going to be playing my super intense character who was like always sharp and on the ball in run 5. And in run 7, I was like, by the time I get to run 7, after I've done run 5, and then Dragon Thrones is new, so I like had no idea what to expect. By the time I got to 7, I was like, I don't know what my life is gonna be like. Turns out I lost my job between 5 and 7. Like all these terrible things happened. I was like really glad that I chose a character who was very like spacey. So every time I had brain fog and couldn't quite put all my thoughts together, I was like, that's just Selena Winters. She's just totally like, yeah, she's just totally out there. And I made her like, I made it like heart-centered play, right? So my objective with that character was to care about other people. That was all she really had to do. She had to care about her house. She had to care about other people. And maybe she cared about herself a little, but not enough. And having a character that was like a little easy mode, at least in the regard of, having to be like super focused on everything at all times, made the experience a lot easier. And I think it made it safer for me too, because I was able to be focused enough playing with a whole bunch of people I hadn't LARPed with before, that I was like really aware of all the safety tools and our calibration tools that we were using. And I was able to kind of like push my my mental focus towards making sure we were having an out of game safe time, and then just kind of like relaxing and rolling with the role play. So there are definitely ways you can plan ahead or like make it part of your character. And I can't speak to this as much because I don't usually use any kind of like mobility aids or anything like that. But sometimes people choose to make a disability part of the character, and sometimes they choose not to. I think it's important to like give people the choice of how they want to handle it. And I've had players in my LARPs where sometimes they're like, I want to explore every aspect of what of this disability. Or they're like, hey, I'm playing a character who has a visible disability, but I myself have a visible disability, but for the purposes of this LARP, please don't reference it or make it a part of the character. I'm just here, especially over like digital experiences. And I think giving people kind of those choices is important. In terms of design and letting people kind of like determine that for themselves, where do both of you kind of fall on that? Like, what do you think you should do? Should you like insist that people, include their real life disabilities as part of their character, or let them choose, or how should they do that?
No, insisting is bad. That's there. You should always have the option about what you want to include in your character. We are, my opinion is we're creating these worlds that we're building, no matter how close to reality or not that they are. And we set the standards as to what they are. And we set what you see, what you hear. We control the horizontal and the vertical, as one of my favorite TV shows, used to say. So we can set the expectation that if I'm supposed to look at you and look at the little green horns on your head and say you're an orc, that you can look at me in a wheelchair and say that I am a frontline fighter, and that you can believe that the same way. We're using our imaginations, like, let's be fair. But we also have to give space for a person to decide how they want to best represent themselves and how they can feel the most empowered to do so in a game. I, for example, in my long-term character that I played over the years, as I got sicker, incorporated into my character that she was debilitated slowly but surely over time by something that was happening to her, so that I didn't have to explain to everybody over and over and over again that out of character and in character were now becoming the same thing. It was just, this was my way of explaining it. But other places I've played, for one of my games, I played Queen Mab, like in a Dresden Files game. And I walked into the room and like 40 people turned around, and like 5 minutes into playing the character, I'm supposed to be holding a room's attention and I could barely stand straight. And so I pulled over a chair, sat down, and nobody questioned. Why? Because that's the community standard we set up, that, if a person's going to play something and they need to sit down, they need to sit down. It's just how it goes. So you have to set that expectation in your community that, like, this is what is acceptable. A person sets their reality and we accept it. And that's the nature of the way things are going. If a person wants to play a character who has a cane, then the cane is in character or not. They set that expectation. And we have to respect it, and so do other players. For me, it's not a question, it's a must.
Totally. And I feel like if you want to play a game and not listen to other people, that's what video games are for, and computer games. Like, if you're LARPing, you are there because you are excited to react to what other people bring to the table. And like Tara, in your example, I thought, like, all right, if you have one person that says, I want to explore my disability, amazing. That person is going to bring a perspective that you don't know about, and that's going to be a great thing for play. If someone else comes up and says, like, please ignore my disability, awesome. We are going to give you an experience where you are briefly not disabled. We are not going to, and both of those things those are two people who are comfortable talking to you and then having an experience with you. And that is the win condition. Then you just tell a fun story. Either way, like, listen to people and use that power of imagination, just as you said, Shoshana, and like, yeah, tell a great story.
Awesome. Jess, is there a question?
Yeah, that's why I popped up here. We actually had a couple of questions pop up during this. So we'll just go one by one. Awesome. So first one comes from Geeky Gimp. What are some ways to navigate brain fog and remembering character info and world setting stuff in a LARP?
I can't believe I forgot the word brain fog. How perfect is that?
It is the best term. Yeah.
I'll go first. For me, like, I will just aggressively write things down like I was playing a tabletop, and like, screw it, I'm there with my notebook. If you have a problem with that, oh well. And if you're in the right type of LARP, you can even say, oh, I'm cursed. I have a bad memory because of a curse. There you go. Additionally, going out of character and running up to someone and say, well, my character would remember your name, like, is big for me. And again, that's preparation and having that book, and communication, and just being honest with people and approaching them.
Yep. I think one of the important things is a tool that we can use more in the real world, which is just saying, man, I forgot. Just like being honest about the fact that, like, we're people, we're tired. It's a long weekend. We just forget things. I think that a lot of the time when you have like brain fog, you feel this obligation to cover it up, like it's embarrassing. And it's like, yeah, we forget things. We're people. And saying that in character, I think also shows a vulnerability for your character, which is great. Like, makes them more human. It makes them more person rather than a two-dimensional creature. It gives you depth. On top of that, yes, aggressively write things down, like, is always what I do. If you have the ability for technology, phones, take pictures of things. It helps. I've done that in LARPs and looked back at stuff if I needed to. And also, honestly, being aware that for me, fibro fog, because I have fibromyalgia, fog in general, is an exhaustion thing. A lot of the time it's tied to exhaustion. So aggressively napping is a thing that I love doing. But even just taking 5 minutes to go sit in a corner by yourself and gather your thoughts, there is no need to be in a rush all the time. Yes, if you're being chased by zombies, that's one thing. But, if you need to just sit down and think, in a quiet place. That's a natural thing that people do.
Yeah, I also do the out of game thing of like, if I'm comfortable enough and I'm there with a friend, I let them know. I frequently at Magic School events, especially, I room with my friend Sharon Underberg, who everyone over here knows, and probably a lot of our listeners too. And Sharon and I have been friends since the first Magic School game, so she's really understanding. And she's also a doctor, so she completely understands when I say I have X. She's very empathetic, and so it really helps. Yeah, it really helps me to have a person who will out of game stand by me if I forget something or don't understand something, and can recognize that I'm getting frustrated. And I try not to put too much of that on people without talking to them, but I check in with her and ask hey, is that okay? And it's really helpful to have friends like that. I also do usually I'll do out of game check-ins with people. So my best friend Callie, Marshall, you've LARPed with Callie before. She'll check in on me when I'm LARPing and she's not, and she'll be like, did you eat things? Did you drink? Are you sleeping? How's your brain? Are you remembering stuff? And it's helpful. And then I'm putting that emotional labor on somebody who isn't even at the LARP. So it's she can kind of handle a little bit more of that because she's not dealing with all the LARP stress and all the stuff going on. So those out of game tools really help me a lot too.
Can I shout out also to Sharon, because she rescued me at Nordic LARP conference at Knudpunkt when I got super sick. Totally rescued me. So she's awesome human being. But checking in with your friends is so key, I think, at games.
Yep, definitely is. So we have another question that just came in from Kate Plays Games. So, Kate, thank you for your question. It is, what should you do if a person's mental illnesses are causing problems within the LARP community? You never want to hold mental illness against someone, and am a person with these issues, but you also want to make sure that play is good for others as well.
Wow, that's a rough one.
Yeah, that is. As someone who sees that in the local community, it is a rough one. I'm interested in finding out what other people think on it too.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts here to start. Sorry for the background noise. Definitely, again, if you're comfortable, if you're a person with mental illness struggles and you are comfortable with sharing that with a friend, and maybe seeing if somebody feels comfortable out of game, kind of checking in with you, that can kind of minimize the stress that you might be putting on other people unintentionally. That's a big thing that I think could help, and I've done that a lot for other people. And I did, I'm divorced, and when the event that caused that divorce happened, I LARPed the next weekend. I was like, no, I have to go to LARP. I need to be around my friends, so my support network. But everybody was also aware that I was having a major life event go on and all this horrible drama. And so what I did was, I kind of checked in with people, and they kind of checked in with me, and we sort of spread it out so that it was more than one person. I wasn't just kind of leaning on one person. So that can help too. But to the original question, it's true. Sometimes that stuff, it just comes out and gets kind of put on other people without permission. And that's really hard to do. One thing I've done before in a LARP was a LARP that had a counselor there. So when I felt like somebody was, pushing that on me too much, or maybe having to deal too much with bleed and complications from a mental health issue or a situation in their life, I went to the counselor and said hey, I'm having this interaction. What should I do? And the answer was you should go out a game and try to communicate with them and let them know that I'm here. So I did that. I went back to the person, and when we interacted, I did the okay check-in, made sure they were doing all right, and they were this. And so we went out a game, and I said, do you feel comfortable talking about it? They told me about a major life event, and I was I've been there, right? do have counselors here, I totally think this is kind of the point that you should go maybe talk. Would you like me to walk over there with you? Do you want me to come with you? And they needed a buddy to walk them over. So I was able to do that and happy to do that. But then I didn't like I'm not a therapist, so I didn't have to do something I'm not qualified to do, or take on that emotional labor that I wasn't really ready to do. Those are the suggestions that I have. But sometimes I can understand that, you might not realize that it's happening. And that is a really tough thing.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, though, that I find really important, which is something that you said, which is that you're not a mental health professional. And that's something that's super important, I think, for us to recognize, that even if games include people who are in character or even out of character counselors, a lot of the people who are brought onto those roles are not mental health professionals. I hope they should be. Please, it would be great if they were. But if they're not, if they're just sort of peer counselors, understanding that there is a limit to what they can handle, and what they should be handling. And at which point there's a line where it's okay, now maybe we need something that's professional care. That's really important to recognize. I think that our communities are open to a myriad of people with a myriad of different psychological makeups, whether or not that's mental illness or just the everyday stressors of life. We're coming to these games with whatever we have in us and our experiences. And sometimes, whether that is going to bring in, personality conflicts or mental illness issues, we have to understand that there will be conflict. There is going to be things that rub up against each other. The problem is that when dealing with mental illness, sometimes you have to understand that there's a question of culpability is a question, really, because sometimes the person doesn't have the ability to control the reactions that they're having and the way that they're impacting your play or your experience. I think two things that I keep in mind are super important. One is communication, is that, well, actually three. Assuming positive intent is something that I think is super important. Not assuming that the person is coming at it from a malicious perspective. Sometimes they're just doing what they're doing and they don't realize what they're doing. Trying to keep communication open. So if you feel comfortable talking to that person, use those check-in tools, use the safety tools. But the third is also that if you're a person coming to the event and you are aware that you have these mental illness issues, whatever they may be, you have to accept the fact that you might not be, you might have a good explanation for why things happen, but it's not an excuse. And therefore, you have to take responsibility for the impact that you're having on the community at large if it's pointed out to you and you're aware of it. You have to be understanding of the fact that you are bringing this to the table, and that you have to listen to when people talk to you and try to work out, how you can best serve the community as well as yourself. It's about keeping open lines of communication and trying to make sure that you don't demonize the other person potentially for what they're bringing forward.
And for me, I think just the worst thing that you could do is treat everyone the same. And if you hear just in a couple words some mental health diagnosis and you think you know someone, you're wrong, because so many of these diagnoses can be so different for different people at different times, and they can have totally different levels of being able to deal with those and different abilities with regards to communication or taking responsibility. And I mean, make sure that you're the type of person that people feel comfortable talking to.
Yeah.
However you do that.
Yeah. Were there any other questions from the audience right now?
No other questions here. So it looks like the queue is open again.
Awesome.
So I'm guessing you probably have other questions you want to bring up as a follow-up to a lot of this.
I'll go back to my own.
Okay, cool.
So this is actually kind of related to what we just talked about. As somebody who identifies as a Spoonie, what kinds of what are you responsible for versus what is the LARP responsible for? So, if you need a certain accommodation or there are certain things you can and can't do, how much of that is your responsibility to communicate or to say, hey, maybe this LARP isn't for me, and how much of that kind of relies on the organizer to kind of put out there this is the accessibility level of our site and stuff like that?
As I mentioned earlier, my list has gotten quite long in the last few years. It went from, hey, I need a quiet place to sleep with an electrical outlet to here's my dietary and movement restrictions. At this point, I don't know how to say this better, but I have no shame just explaining all of it because if I'm going to be coming to an event, I don't want something to happen that is going to surprise anybody. I don't want to like show up and all of a sudden, I am requiring something that they're not prepared for. I want the organizers to know what I'm coming with. For example, I just sent a long email to the organizers of the Nordic Larp conference because I'm like, I need to know where the sleeping space is. I need to know what the food arrangement is. I'm sorry that this is really complicated, but I need to know before I make this long plan to go fly to Europe. Um, and I've been told by organizers, after seeing the restrictions, like, you can't come to this event. But I think that the best thing that organizers can do is just when you're putting together a website, be clear about what your game's about. Put up photos of the location if you have them. Like I wanted to play inside Avernus, and I was like, that's in a cave, sleeping on the ground. That's out for me because that was on the website and it was very clear in the design what was going forward. I've had to ask questions, and organizers have had to come back to me and say, no, I'm sorry, this isn't something that we can accommodate for. And it sucks. But at least we've had that up front so that I don't have to, fly or show up someplace and have a problem. And then it becomes a stressor on the organizers and on myself. So it's important to set those expectations in advance and I hate to say it this way, be clear and be brazen about it. Like just say, this is what I need. There's nothing shameful about explaining what you need out of something. There really isn't.
I really like that, and I think that yeah, there's pretty much nothing to add to it. That's yeah, be brazen with it. I understand how hard it can be sometimes, I imagine, but I'm not the person here who's run a giant event. But you've mentioned, Shoshana, the idea of struggling with finding venues sometimes, and yeah, it's not necessarily malicious when someone cannot do your accommodations. Sometimes, like event runners are trying their best.
Yeah, one thing that helps me is when I see as a player, when I see on like the questionnaire on the form, a question that specifically asks if you need any dietary restrictions, if you know any accommodations, because then I'm like, oh, they've already thought about accommodating me. Now I don't feel guilty saying that I need a room on the first floor or something like that. So I think for designers and organizers, being clear about that in your materials, like on your website and definitely in the questionnaire, because that's like an outreach thing that specifically goes to the player, that's really helpful because that feels really personal. And it's like, most of the LARPs I play now, I play after I know the organizer. So I've already networked with them as a professional. I've already LARPed with them as a player. And so I usually feel pretty comfortable being like, hey, that said, as much as I love supporting my friends and people I already know and do business with, I love trying new stuff, right? And what really helps you try a new LARP is when it says on the site, like, these are the restrictions or accommodations that we can do. This is what the content is about. I'm fortunate in that I don't have too many like triggering things. My thing is I was in a car accident, so as long as you're not going to like put me in a car and like have a head-on collision, I'm usually pretty good. But it makes me feel better overall to see when they're listing all of those difficult content themes for people who may, be triggered by those things and to decide, hey, this LARP is for me, this isn't for me. Just being clear about that again is super helpful. And anything that gets personally delivered to a participant is like the best place to be super clear about like, hey, we can accommodate you. I see Jess pop up again. Is there another question?
Had to turn my microphone back on. Yes, we do. We have another question. This one is from Geeky Gimp. What is the responsibility of a designer or LARP creator if a LARP is held in an inaccessible venue, meaning it does not comply with the ADA? Yeah, it's like we're not getting into like legal stuff. I'm like, this is not it's necessarily a business. It's like, all right. I mean, my gut
Well,
feeling is talk to an attorney.
Well, I mean, first of all, most locations, especially if you're in the United States, are required by law to have certain accessibility by the ADA. However, we all know anybody who has dealt with mobility issues knows that that is absolutely nonsense, and a lot of places don't do that. I live in a city where every store has 2 steps to get in, pretty much. So, hey, with no ramps. So I know what this is about, but like, there's if you're planning the LARP from the beginning and you're looking at the locations and you realize that, the location is not ADA compliant, there are certain things that you can do to talk to the people who run these locations to see, is there a freight elevator, for example, that they can make accessible to you instead? Can we bring a temporary ramp in? Can we do these things? And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes there really is no, and then the question is, do you want to still rent that space and take that chance about that space not being accessible to your players? And that is a really hard question to answer. Also, yeah, you should definitely, if you feel like having that conversation, broach the fact that it should be ADA compliant in their space. And if it's not, maybe they should think about it. But that generally tends to be an adversarial conversation. So,
from my experience, just actually in the theater community of being on the board of a theater company, I make a point to push whenever we're looking at venues and really try to find that ADA compliant venue. I know it's not always possible, probably for some games and some shows, but really, if you're playing an event, try to push and make sure that if it's possible, it happens.
And I would say, no, I usually design solo or like with one other person. And a lot of my designs are meant to be run at conventions, which are usually already accessible, or they are like digital, they're online, and that's as accessible like as I've found to be possible. But when I'm looking at designing larger events, I'm not afraid to team up anymore, right? I hate handling the business. I hate handling the legal. I want to like design and focus on community building and market the game, because those are the things I'm really good at. So one thing that I would say to people who are like intimidated about this as a designer, but still want to make sure to be inclusive and compliant with the ADA, is reach out to a LARP organization or organizer who has done this before and who has done a good job, or who like has encountered this as a challenge before, and ask them or ask to work with them. I usually use, like, I'm in the process of finding venues, and I'm not the one finding them. I'm working with other studios to do that. So I would say if you're starting out, especially, don't be afraid to make sure your LARPs are accessible by asking for help in finding them. Don't necessarily put that on the Spoonie community, like, hey, I see, that you're a gamer with a disability and you want to be in my game, where should I look? Like, that's not their responsibility. But reach out and ask the community at large for help, and consider working with a larger organization that's got a little more experience. That's helped me a lot. More questions in the queue?
I'm not seeing any other questions.
Awesome. I will roll back to my list. Okay. And this is my second to last kind of big question here. We've talked about backing out of events before. I've done it. I've had to actually reschedule even my own digital LARP. Shoshana, you mentioned having paid for some really expensive and amazing digital LARP, or Blockbuster LARP tickets, and having to back out. One thing about being somebody with chronic pain issues is sometimes, at least for me, I feel like I'm a big flake. And everybody that knows me knows I work like 18-hour days. I feel like there are very few people who would think that I don't work hard enough. But I'm paranoid that people think I'm like lazy or I don't work hard enough, because sometimes my body just doesn't. Or because sometimes I have to back out of something. And I really try not to do that, especially not with things I'm running. But at the end of the day, like, I still feel that guilt because I've like flaked out, and I'm like so worried that people are going to stop including me or inviting me, because sometimes I just can't, or sometimes I have to say, you know what, I thought I was going to be up for it, but I'm not. As somebody, who has, these health issues, what are your feelings on that? Like, do you feel like people are going to think of you as a flake? And how do you deal with that?
Oh, wow. So this is actually something that's really hits home for me. I pride myself on being a really hard worker and a really like I push hard and do a lot of things. But over the years, I know that because of my health, I've become more isolated and been unable to attend things and been unable to do things that I used to do. And I've definitely felt potentially that people are including me less in things or in games or in organizing events and stuff like that for a number of reasons. I've literally had people say to my face that like, we're not going to give you this thing because we want to make sure that you're taking care of your health, which is really difficult to hear, right? Like taking that out of my hands. Um, it's it's a real challenge, I think, when you're trying to be a gamer and being a part of a community to try to feel as though your health is not restricting you from being the social community member that you want to be. When you try to even be a professional in the industry, I think it's even harder sometimes because you're afraid that you're going to mess up and have to, I even use the word mess up. That's not the real thing that I should be saying, actually, that my health will restrict me from being able to do certain things. We had to just cancel an event that was supposed to be this Sunday because I was in the hospital over the weekend. And, it sucked. It was one of the first LARPs my company's ever had to cancel because I was in the hospital and we couldn't run it. It was a very difficult choice to make. Am I afraid that that might become something that people might see and not want to go to future events? That's a fear. That's always going to be a fear. But I think that it's important for me. That's one of the reasons as a professional that I find it's important for me to talk about my health issues publicly and be honest with organizers when I attend events, organizers when I plan to attend events, when I'm planning to run things at conventions, that they understand what my health issues are and that they understand that should something happen, it's not that I'm suddenly disappearing on them for no good reason, that it's that I'm probably curled up someplace or in a hospital or can't attend for a good reason. And I think that anybody who would think that that's a flake out is really not somebody you want to be spending time around. I mean, I'm very hardcore about that because I can't feel badly for taking care of myself. That's not something that I can bode in my community about the way we want to treat one another or about the way that I can think about myself as a professional and as a LARPer. So if we want to focus on making the community a welcoming place for people, first of all, we have to cut ourselves some breaks, I think, sometimes. And second, we have to make sure that we cut each other some breaks and have some understanding for one another.
Anything to add to that one, Marshall?
How much can we swear on LARP Chat Live?
We have a mature channel, although we do export to YouTube, so let's keep it at a minimum.
Oh, okay, then just within PG-13, don't think we've used our F-bomb yet. With regards to, as Shoshana points out, of the type of people who are going to like make you feel bad or judge you, fuck them.
Yep.
Because you have definitely already put yourself through the ringer. You know that, I know that. You have like already torn yourself to pieces trying to make this decision.
We're laughing because it's like I've had this conversation with both of you, and I personally feel so much with everyone's gonna think this or think that about me. One thing that I can add, and both of you use much better, more self-loving language than I do. But one thing that I can add that I think is helpful is the same thing that I do with my friendships and with my relationship with my partner, which is like, plan for a thing and realize like sometimes it just doesn't work. So like if I want to go to to see a movie, go on a date to the movie, right? Like we'll plan that, but we might have to, we realize that if I'm having a bad health day, we might have to just like stay home and watch Star Wars, which isn't the worst thing ever, right? Like there's a backup plan, but like that expectation kind of helps. And so I've learned that setting that expectation for myself at LARP helps too. If I'm going to a LARP that has combat in it, I'm going to plan to be super active, right? When I play my Wizard Cop, I plan to be super active and out there fighting and dueling all the time. But I also have the backup of like, I have all these other plots and stories I can kind of hop into and do really diplomatic or emotionally intense RP without physically, being out there like waving my wand around and fighting people. So kind of having a backup plan, I think, has been a big help from me there. That one definitely helps a lot. And the last question I have, which is hopefully a lot more positive and uplifting, is how can the community support Spoonies who LARP? What do you want to see more of in the community, and what does the community do well? Because both of you do a lot, I think, for the community in terms of reminding everybody of here's how you can help, this is how you can help me, vocalizing these things. I'm terrible at doing that. Terrible. So every time I see one of you mention those things or support somebody who's asking for that kind of understanding, it personally helps me a lot. But what do you think? What can the community do, and what are specific things that the community can do to help support Spoonie LARPers?
Marshall, you want to go first?
Sure. Though I'm going to kind of bend the question a little bit because there's a topic that I really want to hit. And that's a big thing that the community can do is realize that almost all of us are working within limitations. And reach the point where we're all comfortable talking about all our weird shit and, pointing out when things are going to be too much. And that includes people who are not comfortable, either identifying or admitting to being chronically ill or disabled or a spoonie or whatever exact terminology you think you might or might not fit into. I was literally at my MS support group, and someone there said in the same sentence, "I am able-bodied," and also said, "I am not able to do the entire MS walk. I cannot walk that far." And it blew my mind about how people are kind of uncomfortable with identifying as perhaps not able-bodied. And it's a really hard thing because to accept your own limitations. But I think if more people are open within this trusting community, we can recognize that we all have a bunch of limitations, and we can all start feeling like we have things that are worth talking about and worth being listened to. So realizing that we're all pretty messed up, biomechanical machines made of spare parts and poor decisions, and just being in a place with, we're all kind of sick. Let's try to make it work.
That is the best description of a human being that I've heard in a very long time. I love it.
Thank you.
Shafana, what would you add?
I would add that I think it's I just coming off of that, I have been to LARPs where I have seen people who are in the best shape that I have ever seen absolutely drop from what is required of them, to the point where I'm trying to keep up with people who are, 10 years my junior, who don't have health issues, who are exhausted and can't stand up after a while. I have seen people literally drop in the middle of LARPs, their muscles burning, screaming because they didn't drink enough water because they were running for hours and hours and hours. We're at conventions where people can't stay up any later because they've been running games for so long. We have to accept the fact that each and every one of us does have limitations, like Marshall said, and we are all people dealing with different levels of it, even if they are people who would be considered quote unquote able-bodied. Our community is diverse. It is important that we recognize that. And if a person says, I don't like the word I can't, it's just not I try not to accept an I can't, although that might be a personal failure on my part. But it's I shouldn't is a better one. I shouldn't do this for my health, or, I'm restricted from doing this. Everybody has those places, and we have to respect them. And for people who are Spoonies, who feel like, stepping to a different topic for a second, for people who are in that position when they are Spoonies, you don't have to stand up and talk about it. But if you feel comfortable advocating for yourself, advocate for yourself, make that the standard that people expect as organizers. You don't have to do it publicly, but just be brave enough to stand up and speak for yourself, to organizers so that they understand that the standard is that they need to listen and hear you. Even if the answer in the end is, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate, at least, maybe next time when they're designing a game, they'll think more about these things, because a lot of times lack of accommodation is only made from a lack of, not from malice, but from ignorance. And so maybe it'll make somebody think. If you're not comfortable advocating for yourself, talk to somebody else who might be able to advocate for you. Ask someone else who's more publicly, out about it, or a friend, anybody who you can. And also, don't be afraid to ask for help. That's really, that's the biggest thing. Make it not just if you're a Spoonie. Don't be afraid to ask for help in the community in general. Like, let's make that the standard. Like, let's, if you need a cup of water and you're quote unquote able-bodied, don't feel bad asking somebody to help you grab one. Weakness is not, needing help is not a weakness. Needing help is what, makes us connected human beings. Asking for help connects us in healthy, caring ways. And by making that a standard in the Larp community, we're going to make it safer for people of all abilities, but especially people who are Spoonies.
That's really excellent advice. Jessica, do we have any more questions?
Marshall has something.
Something to say.
Yeah, definitely something I want to tack on. This doesn't have a lot to do with the previous question, but something I definitely want to say, especially because we've been focusing a lot on bigger games throughout this conversation. And a unique thing with smaller games, and maybe bigger games, is if you're comfortable doing it, design about disability. This is a medium that seeks to expand empathy, and if you can figure out how to do it really smart, it's a great way to make people understand a little bit more about situations that they don't have direct experience in. I feel really proud about a game that I have